August 1921. It must be after midnight now, Milo reasoned, when crossed the landing board at the very top of the generator and she climbed down the outside of the generator building. What had woken her, Milo did not know. Perhaps owls. One had twittered on the roof just then. And on into the kitchen yard and inside, the kitchen door was never locked, and across to the under-housekeeper's room. Milo looked back. Mr. Branson was still asleep. What was she to do about that? Nothing, as it turned out, for Milo had gone immediately to sleep as soon as she put her head onto the pillow. In the morning she opened her door and stood, looking muzzily down the hall. Daisy was in the kitchen, she saw, and down the steps came Mrs. Patmore, tying her apron as she went. "Milo, you surprised me." It was Mrs. Hughes, and she was standing down the corridor, looking at her, heart on her chest. "Aren't I expected?" Milo asked. More confusion. She hated it most of all, when things were not easy to unravel. People changed. They were hard to understand. Yes, you are," she told her. But just then, a shout came, and the kitchen door flung open. "What the dash?" Mrs. Hughes' exclamation was cut short however by her deciding to cross the floor into the kitchen, accompanied by Mrs. Patmore's calls of "Year what?" In the yard, Edna Braithwaite was making a scene, gesturing to the courtyard, gesturing to the field and the woods. The staff followed her, Pied Piper-like, out of the yard, and past the garages and chauffeur's cottage, and into the field. Milo watched from the window as Thomas tore after them, clearly back from wherever he had been. "Mr. Branson," Edna Braithwaite called, and pointed, dramatically, to the man's prone body. He was woken with a bucket of water from Thomas, which delighted Downton's under-butler immensely, before being helped to his feet by Alfred, helping him stagger back to the back door and into the house, to the Irishman's protests of, "No, it's all right, I can manage," when clearly he couldn't. Milo watched, and then turned. He was found then, and he seemed to be awake. Her mind drifted to the letter he was carrying and her hand crept to her pocket. It was still there, that letter from his brother. Tom Branson really did think all of those things then. That he ought to have been her guardian, that he was in line to inherit a baronetcy, more importantly, one linked to her mother's family, the Jamesons. What was he doing there? That is what I want to know. Mrs. Hughes fretted as she ushered the servants inside the kitchen. Edna stood in the center of them all, now joined by the footman, Ivy and Daisy, as well as Mrs. Patmore and Mrs. Hughes. Thomas was in the doorway, Milo noticed, and was about to go to say something to him when Edna spoke. "I did see him go in there with someone last night," she said, a look of innocent horror on her face. "Oh yes," Mrs. Hughes told her. "And just what were you doing out there?" Edna glanced over to Milo and raised a hand. "With her," Edna told them. "She was there." "That is impossible. Milo has been in her room all night," Mrs. Hughes protested. "Really? Then, why is she here at all?" Thomas made to take a step towards Braithwaite, but thought better of it. "Too many people," he thought, "has to be subtler." "Yes," Mrs. Hughes told her, firmly. "Miss Ashby has been invited to stay by Lord Grantham, and she has been in her room. Not that it is your business. And if there's something to tell me, you should have come to see me privately," she added, glancing at all of her staff in turn. "I did see," Edna insisted, looking at everyone for an ally, then dropping her voice, and looking away. "Well practiced," Thomas considered, acting the martyr. "That's just a lie," said Daisy, narrowing her eyes. "If it were try you, you would have gone to see Mrs. Hughes, as she said, not broadcast it to all the staff." "I have to say I agree with her," said Alfred, as Mrs. Hughes called Edna Braithwaite to her, and took her into her sitting room to get her version of events. Ivy and Jimmy shrugged, and behind them, Thomas stood. He stared at the retreating Braithwaite, making a mental note to pay her out at the first opportunity. "Milo," he said warmly, crossing the kitchen floor. "Good to see you," he added, and took her arm, guiding her to the servants' dining hall, and to one of the easy chairs by the empty fireplace. "It's good to see you," Daisy said to her, having followed them, as she lingered by Milo's chair. Thomas gave her a scowl. "Leave them be," said Mrs. Patmore. shooing Daisy away and back to the kitchen. Thomas took the chair opposite Milo. "Is it true what she just said, Braithwaite, that you were in the generator room and Branson was?" Milo looked at her husband, and nodded, slowly. "But not like she said," Milo told him. "And she told him that Branson had followed her, and his confession that he was heir to the Inchicken name. I guessed he was going to tell you to the you when next saw you." Thomas told her it was roughly true. Tom Branson would have come to her, no doubt. Clearly he had evidence of his entitlement now, and also his bastardy. "I have this letter," Milo told him, and she gave Tom's letter to Thomas. He opened it and looked over the foreign language, and then back to Milo. "Do you know what it says?" Milo nodded. "It says," but Thomas put his good hand over folded ones. "Tell me another time I can look for this for you," he told her, and she bowed her head, then nodded. Tears began to slip from her eyes. Hey, what is this?" he asked, kindly. But Milo shook her head. "I just had to find somewhere to sleep," Milo told him, "and Lord Grantham told me I could take my room from today, the 18th, not yesterday, the 17th. Thomas stopped, running her words through his head again, thinking of Milo's logic, not what any other person might have thought or done. "You were in your room," Thomas told her, smiling at her childish logic. "Daft, you are," he sighed. "I wish I had been here," he added, glancing out to the yard, and, half to himself added, "At least we know that he knows." "But I must make sure, somehow," Thomas thought. "Somehow." "I am so glad to see you safe, to see you well," Thomas said, his voice and mind coming back to the present, and he took Milo's hands in his. "Look, stay out of the way today. The family is going to Scotland, and we are packing for them to go." There was a busyness about the place, Milo thought, now that he came to mention it, and Milo nodded. She got up out of her chair, and then stepped to Thomas and gave him a hug. Right, Thomas told her, as she threw herself onto him for a hug. "We will catch up later now. I have to help the family be on their way." 88,888,888 Milo, "Would you like some luncheon?" Mrs. Hughes asked, tapping lightly on her bedroom door. Milo got up and put down what she was reading, coming out into the corridor. "May I speak to you, Mrs. Hughes?" Milo asked her. For thought Thomas had helped her get the events of the previous night straight in her own mind. Something still didn't make sense. Now she knew what it was she had to tell the housekeeper, in her sitting room, as the woman had told her earlier. "Of course," Mrs. Hughes told her, trying not to let the possibilities of what Milo wanted to say enter her mind. "Just sit," Mrs. Hughes told her, and she sat opposite the girl. "Last night, something happened," Milo began. "Something is my fault." Mrs. Hughes' face changed as Milo dipped her head. But the multitude of options on her mental list were soon eliminated when Milo told her that she had been invited by Lord Grantham, and that she knew the invitation was from the day of the 18th, and since the day before was the 17th, she knew she could not stay there the night before. Which makes sense, since the family are going away today. Milo concluded that made sense now. But she was still put out. What the maid had said was, on the face of it, true, but the circumstances were not. "So you thought you didn't have anywhere to sleep?" Mrs. Hughes asked, kindly. "Oh, my, so you went to sleep there, in the generator room, and Mr. Branson came out to see you?" the housekeeper added, stressing the question. "He was drunk, and he saw me, and he was talking to me about all sorts of things," Milo trailed off. "And I climbed up to the top of the generator and slept there," Milo told her, "and when I supposed it was from midnight, I climbed down the outside, so as to leave Mr. Branson to sleep, and came back to my room. Because it was technically the day you were invited," Mrs. Hughes finished, shaking her head. "Weren't you afraid of falling?" Milo shook her head. "I've done it before," she told the Downton Abbey housekeeper. And then she looked down, and felt the wrongness of the maid's words overshadow any reasonable explanation. No, you have done nothing wrong, me Lucina," Mrs. Hughes reassured her. "Then please," Milo asked, her face filling with the same fear of White Bear of her childhood imaginings. When Mr. Carson asks about what the maid said today, can you explain? Explain for me? Milo shook her head, and began to cry. Oh, my dear, Mrs. Hughes said, drawing Milo to her, and this made her cry more. It's not the end of the world, and you did the right thing, she added. Well, a thing which meant you were not in Mr. Branson's company all night, she tutted, and lowered her voice, which is what I think that young madam wants people to think. She patted Milo on the back, absorbing her sobs. There, Mrs. Hughes soothed, and Milo's sobs began to diminish. You were so happy this morning when I saw you. But that was before the suggested scandal to her name. She told herself that Edna needed to be watched before she caused more trouble. I must go, Mrs. Hughes told Milo, as a crash echoed down the corridor. You can stay here as long as you wish, get tidied up and so on. And Milo did so as Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Carson gave the servants their instructions of what needed cleaning and tidying and polishing. Where's Milo? Asked Thomas of Mrs. Hughes, when she found that she wasn't in the under-housekeeper's room. Mrs. Hughes gave him a sorry look. In my sitting room, or at least, that's where I left her, Mrs. Hughes told him. She had been pretty upset, she added. Upset? Thomas asked her. Who has upset her? This morning, Mrs. Hughes told him, a little exasperatedly, for they had a lot to be getting on with. Edna Braithwaite? Thomas nodded, realization flooding in. He had seen that woman getting under Daisy's skin, digging for irritations, and then Mrs. Patmore's, about her cooking, and Ivy's, although the girl had let nothing slip, yet. How unfortunate that Milo had fallen prey to her scheming, who had no defense of that sort to help her out. Thank you, Mrs. Hughes, Thomas said, and nodded to the sitting room door. May I go in? Be my guest, Mrs. Hughes told him, but don't be too long. Mr. Carson has a lot for us all to do, and we need to work hard if we are to get it all done. No defense, and so she needed to be careful, Thomas thought, as the bright eyes of his wife shimmered at him. He would need to teach her to look after herself against people like that, or at the very least, learn to turn and go. How could she be so clever in her academic work, and yet so naive with people? Now the family have gone, we can have a proper talk, Thomas told Milo, who got up and took his hand. He took Milo's hand and brought her back down into the chair again while he took Mrs. Hughes's. I got your letter, he told her, and Milo smiled. He knew it would cheer her, and he tried to make it sound as light-hearted as he could rather than betray the truth that, since he had heard Milo had been invited back for an extended stay, he had gone to the post office every morning at 6 to see if she had sent him a letter. Thomas's patience had not gone unrewarded, and Milo's letter, which contained Lord Grantham's, had been there, waiting to go out on the day's delivery. So she was staying several weeks, then back to the Rutherfords. Good. Lots of things sorted out. Matthew Crawley had left him a message about her house and the Sparks lease of it that he wanted to talk to Thomas about, but he supposed he would talk to him when they got back from Donegal. It was just a pity he hadn't been there when she had arrived. And then it was Thomas's turn to be surprised, as Milo reached into her pocket and withdrew the pocket watch. What's this? He asked, as Milo placed it into his hand. And he overcome when he saw his watch staring back at him, unmendable. Thomas opened up its casing, and then put it to his ear. But she had managed to mend it, somehow. Milo watched her husband's face, a spectrum of emotion crossing it, as he looked at his watch, explored it, listened to it. Happy birthday, she said to him, and he jerked his head to look at her, genuine, unconcealable astonishment on his face. How did you know it was my birthday? Thomas Barrow told her. It says so, on the wedding certificate, she told him. Of course it did, Thomas thought. It is ... perfect, he told her, and drew her in for a hug. Milo could smell Thomas's familiar freshness, even despite a strenuous morning lifting and carrying, and she felt the comfort she always got when they were close to one another. Not like siblings, more like companions, like old couples at the end of their life when desire and emotion and tempest had mellowed. Supportive, fiercest allies, greatest friends. I went to see your brother, she told him. He wrote to me and told me you did, Thomas replied. She pulled away from him, trying to discern if he was cross. Thomas was smiling, though it didn't mean he wasn't cross. I wanted a surprise for you, she went on. If you are cross with me, I can't help that now, but I hope you are not. I am not, he assured her. Thomas, I am sorry I was in the generator building last night, Milo told him again. Tom Branson did come in and followed me. Don't worry about it now, I know there would be no impropriety on your part, Thomas reassured her. To be honest, I would doubt he remembered what he did himself last night. He was so hungover this morning. But listen, he lowered his voice and moved his head towards Milo, whispering, that housemaid, the one who came in and twisted the truth of the matter. Yes, her, Thomas replied. Good, he thought, she already knows to be wary of her. Keep out of the way of her, for she is the sort of person who does things like that to annoy other people. Be polite, just make an excuse, anything. Just say goodbye with yet an explanation if you need to. He saw the look on her face. Try? He encouraged. Yes, I will, Milo told him. He clapped her on the shoulder, and smiled. Look, I'm going into Thirsk. Mrs. Batemore needs to have some fresh ginger picking up, so I said I would go. Do you need anything? No, I don't think so, Milo told him. But Thomas knew her better than that. Come on. Show me what you have brought with you, he said, and they went out of the Mrs. Hughes's sitting room and into that of the under-housekeeper. As I thought, he told her, I was right, you've brought nowhere near enough. I am glad I am going to town. I need more trousers, Milo told him, for she had brought Ernest's old ones that Milo had worn and Thomas had altered for her, the ones she had on now. They were getting threadbare and not worth the mending. Here, she told him, and reached for her purse, and some more Pears soap, and she stopped. Yes? Thomas stopped and looked across to her. No, I can go. Perhaps I can get the train to Ripon, Milo said aloud. You can tell me, he told her, and took her hand, gently. Milo smiled. She liked it when Thomas was happy. Smalls, he told her. I forgot to bring any. That will not be a problem, Thomas told her. Now, he unfolded the letter, from Kieran Branson to his brother. You can read this. Milo nodded, sitting down on the bed. And she did, translating it all for him, even the part where his brother had called him a traitor. It was what Thomas knew, really, he told himself, and now he knew Branson knew. But there was something else. It had caused a rift in the family, politically too. It was no wonder that Branson was keen to accept the land management position here. And that was why it was depressing him, because it forced him to accept the life he knew in Ireland was over. What I'm going to do is give this back to Mr. Branson somehow, Thomas told her and slipped it into his pocket. His fingers touched the smooth sides of his watch and he drew it out again, looking at it. Thomas got to his feet. Come out when you feel like it. Have a sleep if you got none last night. Just lock the door. Ask Mrs. Batemore for some dinner. Everyone would like to see you again. Thomas was about to go, but then turned back, noticing the opal necklace. He touched her neck as he lifted it in his fingers. It is beautiful. I can hardly tell the repair, Thomas told Milo. Henry says. He broke off, looking about him. Henry wrote that you checked it and believe it's real. It would be real enough to me whatever it was, Milo told him, because you gave it to me. But yes, I have analyzed the rocks with opal in them from Australia, and they have the same metals in them. Thomas looked at the opals. I can't see any metals, he told her. The metals have reacted with other elements, Milo told him, patiently, usually oxygen. They make different compounds then, which gives them different colors. If only his father were alive. Wouldn't he love to take Milo to see him and show her off? Have her tell him that what he thought were worthless were actually valuable precious stones? Vindicate himself, so to speak. Thomas had wondered so many times if he ought to have married her, on the basis of giving her a chance to enter university. Save her from some guardian. Now he was sure he had done the right thing. Tom Branson would have been her guardian and God knows how that would have ended. The prestige of her success was now rubbing off on him, as well as the insurance of being able to say he was married, and get past obstacles when he was looking, and he was always looking, of hostility, and be able to say, I think you have the wrong idea too. Have you met my wife? And that was besides the small fortune he had in a savings account, which he could also barely believe. If only Ernest was there to see it all. He missed his lover so much. Thomas, are you having a good birthday? Milo asked, as he got to the door. Thomas smiled. What with the ability to blackmail Tom Branson, and make Edna Braithwaite's days immensely difficult. Yes, he told her truthfully, a really good birthday. 88,888,888. Why is he buying presents for her now? Jimmy Kent, who had been with Thomas Barrow and Mrs. Patmore in Thirsk, had seen Thomas Barrow purchase several things from Harvey's the department store and have them wrapped. For Milo, Mrs. Patmore, Thomas had said when she'd asked, but Jimmy, exhausted after their day cleaning what felt like everything at Downton Abbey, just felt aggrieved. I heard a rumor they were married, Ivy put in, closing her eyes, and opening them again, for she was tired, too. They had stripped out the larder, under Mrs. Hughes's supervision, and her arms ached for the stretching and cleaned down every shelf. At her words, Daisy turned her head sharply. Where did you hear that, Ivy Swinson? She shot back. Ivy leaned towards them, and then stopped. Mrs. Hughes had come into the servants' dining room and sat down. You are all very quiet tonight, she said, and they all got up as Mr. Carson came in. We're tired, Daisy told her, when Mrs. Hughes asked why they were so quiet. Good, she said. No one died of hard work. Silence. The servants nodded to Mrs. Hughes, but said nothing. They were all indeed tired. Good, thought Daisy, too. No one to gossip about poor Milo, no one to spread rumors about her. She shot Edna a scowl to the side of her head. But, now this from Ivy. She hoped it ain't get about Ivy had found out, but Milo had told her, hadn't she? As they were eating their tea in silence, Thomas came into the servants' dining room and took his place, sitting down in silence. He looked up and down the table. The door to the under-housekeeper's bedroom was still closing. Ivy, Edna, Alfred and Jimmy all looked up and gave one another an inferring look, meaning to gossip about it later when they could. Who's died? Thomas asked, though no one even rose to that. They really must have been exhausted. Then noticed them all watch as he made to eat his dinner. What? Asked Thomas, a piece of chicken halfway to his lips. The four looked away. Daisy gave him a sorrowful look, and went back to look in for her dinner too. What? Thomas asked again. We were just wondering whether Miss Ashby was going to join us, said Jimmy. Thomas gave him a scowl. Mr. Carson, Thomas said, turning to Downton's butler. Would you inform James that, considering the misunderstanding at the servants' ball, he gave Jimmy a withering look, and the misunderstanding this morning, and glared at Edna. Miss Ashby feels she wishes to be in her own company. All of the servants looked at Mr. Carson. Well, Carson looked at them. You heard Mr. Barrow, he told them. Not it is any of your business what Miss Ashby does, guest as she is of Lord Grantham. But she's down there, Edna pointed out. She's a guest of Lord Grantham's, but she's staying below stairs. What's that about? That's her room, Daisy pointed out. When she stays here, she's not really family. But Mr. Branson was the chauffeur, and now he is upstairs, Edna Braithwaite was at pains to point out. Carson gave her a grave look. He is upstairs because he is Lord Grantham's son-in-law, he rolled her. And isn't Miss Ashby sponsored by him? Edna Braithwaite pushed. If she's his guest, what is she down here for? It was a good line of logic. But Mr. Carson had picked up something else from Thomas's passive-aggressive information-giving, and he wanted to know what he meant by it, while Daisy replied, she likes it down here. Misunderstanding this morning? Over to you, Miss Braithwaite, Mrs. Hughes told the maid, folding her arms. And when Edna Braithwaite began, with a look of pure happy malice in her eye, to recount her version of events with Mr. Branson, with extra embellishments no doubt, Mrs. Hughes took it in hand to set the record straight. Actually, I had better speak, in the spirit of accuracy, she told them all, and Thomas could not disguise his smirk, even if he had wanted to, which he probably wouldn't have. Miss Ashby, being as she is, read literally into Lord Grantham's instructions, being in the kind of profession she is in. Consequently, Mrs. Hughes went on, and knowing how rigidly Mr. Carson enforces those rules, something which she respects very highly, Mrs. Hughes added, and was rewarded with a nod from Carson, which lifted the record somewhat higher. Miss Ashby went to find somewhere to wait until midnight, at which point she came back in. She looked across to Mr. Carson, who had not said a word, to his credit, and Mrs. Hughes then looked back to the staff. Miss Ashby is like that. For all of those people who have known her, since she first started coming here with her family, when she was 5, we are used to her, she continued, firmly. Those of you who have not, need to know that any disrespect to Miss Ashby will be dealt with most severely. This was Mr. Carson now, who had been touched by Mrs. Hughes' mention that Milo repeated his rules. And she is like a part of this place. When you switch on the lights in the scullery in here, in your own rooms, Mrs. Hughes emphasized, waving her arm, that was not Ernest Ashby's work, but Melusina's. She made the wiring, she designed the circuits. Mrs. Hughes got to her feet, for she had seen a figure standing just in the corridor, and went to her, quickly, and took her hand before Milo had a chance to change her mind. This young woman had achieved things we can only dream of. She works with the best minds of science. No, Mrs. Hughes told them, not works with them. She is one of the best. Her work had been published. Other scientists are using what she has found for your own research. And that's to say nothing of the electrical devices she can make and she can repair as quick as, blink your eye, Mrs. Hughes added. So you will not make up stories, or exaggerate the truth, Edna Braithwaite, Mrs. Hughes emphasized, giving the maid a withering look, then continued to address all the staff. Mr. Branson had been drinking heavily, not that the family know, and he found Miss Ashby in the electrical generator room. Knowing her as he does, he went to talk to her. At this point, she looked to Milo, who nodded, but ended up dead drunk in there. Milo had the sense to tuck herself away until she knew she was officially allowed to stay in her room. Just so you are clear, she can go where wants. Within reason, Carson clarified. Mrs. Hughes turned to him in annoyance. Mr. Carson, we have known this young woman for the longest time, and I for one know that her integrity has never once wavered. Silence persisted for a long time, silence born of a long speech and the hypnosis that went with it. Alfred broke the spell, and began to clap, getting to his feet and clapping and pushing his chair back, ignoring Carson's look of disapproval, and he went over to Milo, a grave look still on her face, and clapped her on the shoulder. Well done, Miss Ashby, he told her, his words genuine in their happiness for her. And after that, everyone congratulated Milo, even Edna, though somewhat reluctantly, Mrs. Hughes considered, and Daisy brought her to sit between her and Thomas. A happy birthday. Thomas smiled, pleased that everyone would assume the smile was for the hearty lauding of his friend Milo Ashby. The day had just got so much better. 88,888,888. I don't care what anyone says, I saw her, and I saw him. Edna to Ivy that night. The door was closed, but Daisy was in her bathroom. Mr. Branson was drunk, Edna, Ivy said. She was sorry to have mentioned it, and hoped they could stop now, as Daisy would soon be back in with them. Even if nothing did happen, it wasn't just ... Yeah, no, Edna continued. I heard Mr. Branson confront her about money, something about an inheritance. Are you sure? Ivy asked, fascinated. He was sort of disgusted that Miss Ashby had married Mr. Barrow. I don't want to talk about this anymore, she told Edna. It had been embarrassing. Anyway, why were you there anyway? Yes, Daisy asked, coming in quickly and closing the door. Why were you there? Edna said nothing, but turned over in bed. Daisy put the light off, and they all lay there in the darkened silence. When Daisy's breathing had lengthened and Edna decided she must be asleep, she turned over to face Ivy. There was a letter he had, Edna told Ivy. He was waving it around towards her. The trouble with you, Edna, said Ivy, is that you tell so many stories no one knows what to believe. Edna huffed in indignation. She waited until Ivy was asleep, and then pulled back her covers. I don't care if you believe me or not, Edna told herself, before slipping out of their bedroom, you or anyone. I'm going to find that letter,